By the time King George IV took his last breath on June 26, 1830, the man who had once been referred to as the first gentleman of England had become a grotesque caricature of royalty. He was a bloated, decomposing mass of flesh that horrified even his own servants. In the annals of British royal history, there have been few deaths that have been as gruesome, pathetic, or completely devoid of dignity as that of King George IV. This is the tale of a king who didn't pass away as a ruler, but rather as a living corpse, abandoned by his people and reviled by history itself. Despite the fact that it had taken decades for him to go from being a dazzling prince to a loathed king, the ultimate plunge into physical and spiritual decay sped drastically in his final years. A cautionary tale of absolute authority corrupted by total luxury, told through the eyes of those who lived through the tragedy of George IV's dying days. What you're going to watch is not just the death of a king, but the complete collapse of a human person. This is a story that you are about to witness. The eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, George Augustus Frederick, was born on August 12, 1762. He was designated as the Prince of Wales. The fact that he was born into a royal family gave him every advantage that a royal birth could bestow: brilliance, charm, and remarkable good looks that made him the toast of fashionable society when he was younger. On the other hand, even when he was still a young prince, the seeds of his impending demise were already beginning to take root. His father, George III, was a strict and intensely devout individual who kept a repressive home that placed a high importance on moral rectitude above all else. This resulted in an atmosphere that was so oppressive that the young prince found it intolerable during his childhood. George had already established himself at Carlton House on London's Pall Mall by the time he became 21 years old. It was then that he started what would become a career of well-planned and executed acts of self-destruction. It would have been impossible to find a greater striking contrast between the father and the son. His heir, on the other hand, embraced excess in every imaginable form, in contrast to George III, who was known for his frugality and moral discipline. During this time period, the prince surrounded himself with people who were dissolute, consumed great quantities of wine, and engaged in a series of scandalous affairs that pleased the satirical press of the day. George's change from a lovely young prince into something far more diabolical began in the 1780s. This was the beginning of his transformative journey. He became famous for his voracious appetite for fatty foods. The customary breakfast was 2 pigeons, 3 beefsteaks, 3 portions of a bottle of white wine, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy. In addition, 4 glasses of brandy were consumed. In fact, this was just the beginning of his daily intake, which would continue with extravagant luncheons and dinners that were more akin to ancient Roman orgies than they were civilized meals. As his weight increased, so did the amount of debt he owed. George owed enormous sums of money to some of the most famous merchants and money lenders in London by the time the 1790s rolled around. Despite the fact that Parliament continually bailed him out, each financial rescue just enabled him to become ever more extravagant. It appeared as though the prince was incapable of developing self-control, since he regarded money as an endless resource that existed purely for his own enjoyment. The amount of money he spent on merchandise, furniture, artwork, and entertainment. Even the most opulent members of the nobility were taken aback by the sheer magnitude of the entertainment that was provided. Relationships that the prince had with his friends and family were also disastrous. His following official marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795 became one of the most disastrous royal unions in the history of the United Kingdom. Additionally, his illicit marriage to the Catholic widow Maria Fitzherbert in 1785 caused a constitutional problem. During their first encounter, George was so repulsed by his bride that he demanded brandy. Caroline, on the other hand, made the observation that he was extremely overweight and not nearly as handsome as he appeared in his portrait. During the night of their wedding, George was discovered unconscious and intoxicated in the fireplace. This event served as the beginning of a relationship that would go on to cause scandal across Europe. A source of public entertainment, Newspapers and satirical cartoonists documented every vile detail of the couple's split, which resulted in the couple's mutual animosity being a source of public comedy. The manner in which George treated Caroline, whom he subsequently attempted to divorce after he became king, exemplified a brutality that went well beyond the basic disturbances that occurred within the marriage. In addition to removing her name from the Book of Common Prayer and actively excluding her from court, he even made an attempt to prevent her from attending his coronation. When Caroline passed away unexpectedly in the year 1821, many people came to the conclusion that the strain of her husband's persecution had accelerated her passing. As George's body began to reflect the terrible effects of his lifestyle, it was during these decades of scandal and excess that he underwent these changes. By the year 1797, when he was 35 years old, he had already reached a weight of 245 pounds, which was an astounding figure for the time period. His appearance, which was formerly regarded as one of the most gorgeous in England, started to become bloated and distorted. At the same time as his previously athletic figure vanished beneath layers of fat that made simple movement increasingly difficult, he developed a series of chins that could not be concealed by any amount of stylish cravats. It is important to note that the prince's vanity did not change. In spite of the fact that his physical appearance was deteriorating, he employed a large number of tailors, corset manufacturers, and cosmetic artists in order to keep up the appearance of his previous attractiveness. One observer made the observation that his corsets were engineering wonders, a bastille made of whalebone, which was designed to compress his large belly into a shape that was resembling that of a human with a human body. He wore expensive wigs to conceal his receding hair, used rouge and powder to conceal his diminishing complexion, and dressed in ever more colorful clothes that aimed to distract from his physical deterioration. All of these things were done in an effort to conceal his deteriorating appearance. In 1810, when George III experienced his final mental breakdown, his eldest son was legally elevated to the position of Prince Regent, which gave him the authority to exercise royal power. Meanwhile, his father spent the remaining years of his life in a state of insanity and seclusion. It would have been appropriate for the prince to reach his highest point of accomplishment during the Regency period, which lasted until George III's death in 1820. Instead, it was the beginning of his transformation from a simple, dissolute prince into something far more heinous and pitiful. It was the event that marked the acceleration of his personal decline. When George became Prince Regent, he was granted an unprecedented amount of power to restructure British society in accordance with his preferences. Wonderful work was commissioned by him. Architecture projects provided financial support to the arts on a scale that had not been seen since the Renaissance. These projects also presided over some of the most brilliant social seasons in the history of London. However, hidden beneath the surface of his cultural accomplishments was a developing darkness that would soon take him completely. Additionally, his addiction to laudanum, which is a liquid form of opium, began to cloud his mind for days at a time. His drinking levels rose to the point where even his contemporaries who were heavy drinkers were horrified. The fabled banquets of the regent evolved into hideous exhibitions of consumption that appalled guests from other countries. Over the course of a period of 6 weeks in the year 1816, Carlton House received more than 5,000 pounds of beef. This quantity does not include sausages, pig, or poultry. The prince would take quantities of food that appear to be incomprehensible to any human being, and he would wash it down with rivers of wine, champagne, and spirits that would leave him in a daze for a number of hours. His supper parties stretched from the early afternoon till dawn, and guests frequently left in a state of disbelief that the prince had behaved in such a manner. By the time George ultimately succeeded to the throne as George IV in the year 1820, he had already become a figure of mockery rather than reverence. It was attacked as an example of megalomaniacal extravagance as his coronation, which cost about $1 million, which was an unfathomable price at the time, exceeded expectations. His gigantic bulk was forced into silver tissue robes that made him resemble, in the words of one observer, a magnificent whale dressed for a masquerade ball. The new king appeared in a crown that was ornamented with more than 16,000 diamonds that had been leased. In the early years of George's reign, there were a number of political crises that brought to light the fact that he was fundamentally unsuitable for the position of king. His attempt to divorce Queen Caroline resulted in a public spectacle that resulted in the British people turning against him in a decisive manner. Additionally, his meddling in government policy displayed a grasp of statecraft that was both foolish and dangerous. Parliament learned to operate around the monarch rather than with him, effectively limiting him to the role of a ceremonial figurehead whose sole duty was to prevent further scandal from occurring. George's physical state deteriorated at a startlingly rapid rate throughout the course of the 1820s. As his weight continued to rise, he became one of the most obese people in Britain. His weight had surpassed 280 pounds. It was so uncomfortable for him to move that his legs, which had become swelled as a result of fluid retention, became excruciating. His servants were forced to carry him through his own palaces like a big, breathing piece of furniture because it became hard for him to mount the stairs. Cognitive dissonance was caused by the mismatch between his public image as king and his private reality as an invalid. This conflict drove him farther into isolation and dependent on others. During this time period, the king's addiction to laudanum reached genuinely deadly levels. He often ingested over 100 drops of the substance before making public appearances, which is sufficient to put the majority of people unconscious. It was impossible for him to concentrate on government business for more than a few minutes at a time, since the medicine left him in a constant state of haze. It was embarrassing for his ministers to listen to him deliver speeches that were meandering and incoherent events, and thrilled those who opposed him. It was stated by ambassadors from other countries that the King of England looked to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs during the majority of important events. By the late 1820s, George's eyesight had already begun to deteriorate to the point of catastrophic failure, adding yet another layer of humiliation to his already pitiful existence. As was the case with his father, he was diagnosed with severe cataracts, which rendered him practically blind. Even though he underwent a simple operation on his eyes in September of 1829, the procedure did not give him with much relief. He was no longer able to sign documents by the time December 1828 rolled around, which compelled Parliament to devise a stamp that could be used to apply his signature while he was present. Once upon a time, the king took great pride in his exquisite handwriting. Nevertheless, he was unable to write his own name anymore. George's later years were marked by a particularly terrible attack from gout, which is a disease that is traditionally associated with wealthy people. As a result of the swelling and discomfort that he experienced in his hands and feet, even the slightest touch may cause him to experience excruciating pain. As a result of his hands becoming so malformed that he was no longer able to grasp a pen or even a fork, he was compelled to wear shoes that were specifically constructed to accommodate his grotesquely swollen feet. The monarch, who had formerly been renowned for his refined manners, was reduced to being fed like an infant by his staff, who were becoming increasingly revolted. Even people who saw George on a regular basis were taken aback by the significant changes that occurred in his physical appearance during his final years. It was claimed by Sir David Wilkie, who had painted the portrait of the king in 1829, that George was deteriorating in a frightening manner day to day. In spite of the fact that he was big, the artist described the experience as being extremely challenging and depressing. He compared the monarch to a large sausage that had been pushed into the covering. Wilkie's painting, which was diplomatically flattering in the same way that royal portraits typically were, was not able to completely cover the reality that its subject had lost any identifiable resemblance to a human being. George's excessive weight caused his lungs and heart to get squeezed, which resulted in his breathing becoming increasingly laborious. As a result of the pressure that was being placed on his chest, he was no longer able to lie down with his back straight in bed. The alternative was for him to be compelled to sleep in an upright position in a chair that had been particularly designed for him, with his head resting on his palm and his body being supported by a complex arrangement of pillows and cushions. Even though he was in this posture, He was unable to find any solace because his slumber was continuously disrupted by bouts of coughing and gasping, which left him weary and begging for more laudanum. The skin of the king, which was formerly admired for its beautiful color, turned out to be a terrifying sight to behold. It had been stretched to the point of breaking due to layers of fat, which resulted in folds and creases that were never adequately cleaned, which led to infections and sores that refused to heal. His face, which was so bloated that it was impossible to recognize, took on a grayish tone that suggested that it was decaying from the inside out. The sensation of pressing into the king's flesh was described by servants as being similar to pressing into raw dough. It was soft, yielding, and somehow unwholesome in a way that caused even the most seasoned members of the palace staff to recoil in revulsion. The odor that was coming from George's body eventually transformed into one of the most commonly noted elements of his later years was the fact that, despite the efforts of his valet and physicians, his huge form had become impossible to maintain clean in the appropriate manner. When servants entered his apartments, they would gag due to the overwhelming odor that was caused by the mixture of open sores, unwashed body folds, and the adverse effects of the different medications that he was taking. An odor that suggested the process of decomposition had already begun led visitors to Windsor Castle to remark that they were able to smell the presence of the monarch from chambers that were located further away. In his later years, George's eating habits, which were already notorious for their excessiveness, became much more unsettling. Due to the medications he was taking, he was unable to properly taste food. As a result, he compensated by demanding dishes that were increasingly complex and intensely spicy. His hunger remained huge despite the fact that his health was obviously not in good shape, and he would take many dishes even when he was obviously in a state of agony. The staff at Windsor Castle thought it was one of the most pitiful things they had ever seen when they saw the dying king desperately trying to force food into his mouth while he was gasping for air. There is a possibility that the psychological repercussions of George's physical deterioration were even more terrible than the physical changes themselves. A man who had spent his entire life preoccupied with his appearance confronted his change into a horrible imitation of his previous self. He had spent his entire life fascinated with his appearance. On his own initiative, mirrors were gradually removed from his private chambers because he could no longer stand to see his own reflection. Once upon a time, the prince would spend hours each day polishing his toilet, but now he avoided looking at himself completely. The worsening of his condition led to an increase in both his paranoia and his sadness. In several instances, George's assumption that his attendants were making fun of him behind his back was completely true. He grew sure that his servants were making fun of him. At the least perceived offense, he would explode into a wrath, and then he would collapse into spasms of weeping that could last the better part of an hour. Due to his emotional instability, which was further exacerbated by his addiction to drugs, he became increasingly difficult to manage. Even his most devoted retainers started to dread the tasks they were supposed to perform. As his illness worsened, the king's isolation from the rest of the world became almost entirely complete. Only in a wheelchair that was specifically designed to accommodate his tremendous weight did he venture out of his own residences, and even then, he did so only in a wheelchair that was particularly made. Because of his physical limitations and the embarrassment he felt about his appearance, the man who had once been the center of London's social universe now lived like a prisoner in his own palace. He was cut off from normal human contact. The interaction between George and his physicians got increasingly adversarial as the severity of George's condition increased. Sir Henry Halford, the royal physician, was frequently subjected to verbal abuse from the monarch, while other physicians suffered the consequences of being fired for delivering truthful assessments of the state of their patients. George desired to have medical specialists who would tell him what he wanted to hear, that he could return to his previous state of health, that his weight could be lowered, and that his eyesight may perhaps be restored. When it came to his hopeless predicament, the truth was that he would rather shoot the messenger than face the reality of the situation. As George's condition continued to deteriorate, the government began to display a growing level of anxiety regarding the political consequences of the situation. A monarch who was physically incapable of functioning at all, who was addicted to drugs, and who demonstrated increasing signs of mental instability constituted a significant risk to the stability of the monarchy. There was a constitutional issue that had no obvious precedent or solution, and ministers started discussing contingency preparations for dealing with a sovereign who might become entirely incapable while still officially alive. This created a crisis that had no apparent precedent or solution. Despite the palace's best efforts to keep the state of the king's health a secret, the public gradually became aware of his condition. Satirical cartoonists, who had been making fun of George's weight for decades, suddenly started depicting him as a monarch who was literally on his deathbed and whose prolonged life was a shame to the nation. A source of bitter humor among the British people was the difference between the official bulletins regarding the king's health, which spoke of indispositions and temporary setbacks, and the reality of his condition. The official bulletins described the king as having temporary transitory setbacks. As the condition of their royal master continued to deteriorate, the servants at Windsor Castle began to exhibit a disturbing lack of respect for who they were serving. Footmen would openly moan about having to lift the immense weight of the king, while chambermaids would speak about the horrible odor that pervaded his quarters at the same time. As staff members battled to maintain their dignity while dealing with a king who had clearly lost his own, the intricate protocols that were in place for royal service began to fall down. At the same time that George's physical suffering got more severe, his sleeping patterns became increasingly unpredictable. As he fought with pain and breathing difficulties, he would doze off intermittently throughout the day, and then he would stay awake for hours during the night, requesting that staff sit with him. His nightly rantings, which were frequently provoked by laudanum, were legendary among the workers of the palace. They would draw lots to choose who would have to suffer the company of the monarch during his midnight vigils. In spite of the fact that he was obviously in poor health, the king's thirst for alcoholic beverages did not decrease. Furthermore, he continued to consume tremendous quantities of wine, champagne, and spirits, frequently combining them in ways that would have resulted in the instantaneous death of a less capable individual. In spite of the fact that his speech remained slurred and mostly incoherent, his tolerance for alcohol had reached such a high level that regular individuals would be rendered unconscious by levels of alcohol that just made him somewhat more talkative. By the year 1829, George's condition had deteriorated to the point where he was no longer able to carry out even the most fundamental duties associated with monarchy. His inability to understand state paperwork, his inability to sign documents, and his inability to grasp political talks were all indications of his confusion. The machinery of government continued to function around him, but the monarch himself had become little more than a living corpse that periodically roused to make ridiculous demands or issue incomprehensible instructions that everyone ignored. He had become a living corpse. Relocating George from one room to another became a significant logistical task that required teams of servants and specialized equipment. This was necessary because of the physical act of relocating George. For the purpose of transporting him, a chair with wheels was made. However, even this proved to be insufficient for someone of his size and medical condition. The sound of the king being dragged through the hallways of the palace, which included the creaking of machinery, the groans of straining attendants, and George's own hard breathing, became an audible reminder of the degeneration of the monarchy. As George's condition worsened, his personal hygiene, which had never been particularly rigorous even when he was in better health, diminished to the point that it was almost non-existent. He was difficult to keep clean, but his height and medical condition made it practically impossible for him to be properly washed. His workers fought to keep him clean. There were times when the king would go weeks without taking a bath, and the fact that his body was not bathed added to the already overpowering stink that was associated with his presence. The guests who came to the palace were instructed to breathe through their mouths whenever they were in the vicinity of the king. During George's latter years, the disparity between his public persona and his private life reached its zenith, reaching its most extreme extent. Despite the fact that official photographs continued to depict a dignified ruler dressed in superb robes, Individuals who had the opportunity to interact with the king described a creature that was completely dissimilar to the depictions that were used in official portraits. The gap between royal propaganda and lived reality got so large that it appeared almost strange, as if this conversation were taking place between two persons who were utterly different from one another. The mental state of George had become unpredictable and frequently dangerous as a result of his addiction to drugs. Periods of seeming lucidity would be followed by episodes of utter disorientation, during which he would be unable to recognize even his closest staff. He would have these episodes alternatingly. The reliability of his memory deteriorated to the point where he would forget talks that had taken place just a few minutes previously, and then he would explode into rages when reminded of his capacity for forgetfulness. The worsening of the king's mental state caused him to become increasingly paranoid and suspicious of everyone in his immediate vicinity. And further depth of sadness was given to George's already awful position by the religious awakening that he had in the closing months of his life. The man who had spent decades openly disobeying Christian morals suddenly became preoccupied with obtaining divine pardon for his transgressions. He had spent decades in open disobedience of Christian morality. He would spend hours confessing his wrongdoings to clergymen who were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with him. He would describe his entire life of drunkenness with a level of specificity that terrified everyone who listened to him. Although his newly discovered piety appeared to be real, it was weakened by the fact that he continued to be unable to change his harmful behavior. Due to the fact that George's taste for laudanum had grown to such an immense extent, his doctors were concerned that he would accidentally overdose himself during one of his moments of emotional instability. In spite of the fact that the quantity of opium that was present in his system was sufficient to execute a number of regular persons, the king's tolerance was so high that he appeared to function normally, or at least as normally as his condition led him to function. Despite the fact that his physicians started diluting his prescription without informing him, George continued to insist on taking increasingly higher quantities. There was a growing likelihood that the monarch would pass away as his relationship with food became more and more problematic. In spite of the fact that it was evident that he was unable to digest meals in the correct manner, he continued to insist on lavish dinners consisting of multiple courses, which he would swallow with a mechanical resolve. The sight of George attempting to force food down his throat, while obviously in distress, became one of the most unsettling elements of his final time. It suggested that he had lost all connection to his own physical requirements and limitations. As George's condition worsened, he found it increasingly difficult to maintain even the most basic of personal ties. His long-standing mistress, the Marchioness Cunningham, increasingly removed herself from the court as the king's appearance became too macabre to bear. She was unable to tolerate the king's appearance. His few remaining acquaintances sought excuses to avoid visiting Windsor Castle, leaving George surrounded only by paid staff who could scarcely contain their disgust at his presence. His friends also found excuses to avoid visiting Windsor Castle. In essence, the monarch passed away by himself, despite the fact that he had been surrounded by admirers and sycophants in the past. The odor of decay that was located all about George eventually grew so overpowering that it started to have an effect on the other people who lived in Windsor Castle. According to reports, Queen Adelaide, who was married to George's brother William, who would later become known as William IV, relocated to different quarters in order to get away from the odor. Those who remained in the service began to put cloths across their faces in order to filter the air that they breathed. Meanwhile, those who were employed began to volunteer for tasks that would take them away from the king's residential quarters. As the period of time leading up to George's passing drew nearer, his illusions got more complex and divorced from reality. He would occasionally assert that he had participated in the Battle of Waterloo, despite the fact that he had maintained his safety during the entirety of the Napoleonic Wars in England. In stark contrast to his actual situation, which was that of an immobilized ill who could hardly lift his own head, he delighted in fantasizing about the glory he would achieve in the military. These bouts of grandiose thinking were interspersed with periods of severe depression, during which George would cry for hours about the life he had wasted. Over the course of the king's final months, he experienced an increasing number of medical emergencies, all of which his physicians were unable to properly treat. It became increasingly difficult for his heart to pump blood through his large frame, and it began to fail more regularly. His breathing became so laborious that even the least exertion would leave him gasping for air and looking pale because of the strain it caused. In spite of the fact that his medical professionals were aware that death was unavoidable, they were unable to accurately forecast when or how it would take place, which left everyone in a mood of gloomy expectation. During his latter time, George was accompanied by a continuous companion in the form of physical discomfort. The combination of gout, dropsy, heart failure, and a number of other maladies resulted in a symphony of misery that could not be entirely suppressed by any amount of laudanum. He would scream out in anguish throughout the night, and his screams would reverberate through the halls of the palace, which would completely terrify the personnel. The anguish that the king was experiencing was so clear and so consistent that even his most scathing critics started to feel some compassion for him and his suffering. It was during George's reign that the regular procedure of the palace was broken. The extraordinarily severe extent of his disease was reflected in his final months. It was now common practice for servants who would have been fired for even the slightest infraction to openly acknowledge their master's deplorable state. Staff members struggled to cope with responsibilities that went well beyond anything they had been educated to handle, which led to the collapse of the tight hierarchy that dominated royal homes. It appeared as though the monarchy itself was on the verge of disintegrating alongside its ruler. When George became aware that his own death was drawing near, he experienced a terrifying dread that was excruciating to behold. In spite of the fact that he was experiencing bodily pain, he clung to life with all his strength, pleading with his physicians to provide him with medicines that could even temporarily prolong his life. It was so terrible that he would refuse to sleep because he was sure that he might not wake up. His fear of death was that intense. These existential dreads added a psychological layer to his agony, which made his final months even more painful for those who were there to see them. In light of the fact that the king's digestive system was beginning to deteriorate, the king's bowel movements became an important topic of medical concern. Because of the massive quantities of food that he ingested, his body was no longer able to metabolize it effectively, which resulted in excruciating blockages that would sometimes linger for several days. When he did achieve some degree of relief, it was frequently accompanied with blood and other concerning indications that his internal organs were beginning to shut down. The servants at the palace, who had long since abandoned any pretense of royal decorum, discussed these private medical information in an open and honest manner. Visitors from religious institutions who came to pay their respects to the dying king claimed that George's confessions had grown so thorough and upsetting that they questioned whether or not listening to them was beneficial to their own spiritual healing. The king's account of his crimes throughout his entire life was so detailed and graphic that it appeared to be less of a kind of repentance and more of a final indulgence in the very behaviors that he claimed to regret. It was difficult for his spiritual advisors to offer solace to a guy whose sense of guilt seemed to be on par with the magnitude of his physical characteristics. An enthusiasm that was on the verge of becoming indecent was displayed by the political elite as they started making preparations for George's death. His brother William, who was the apparent heir apparent, was briefed on royal protocols while George was still alive, and government ministers made no effort to conceal their relief at the thought of a new monarch. The fact that George had alienated everyone around him to such a degree was made clear by the contrast between the formal demonstrations of concern for the king's health and the private plans for his succession. There were a number of false alarms that occurred during George's final weeks, which caused the staff at the palace to remain in a condition of perpetual alertness. His condition would look to be terminal, yet he would recover momentarily before falling back into a state of crisis once more. The psychological toll that these incidents took on everyone concerned was significant, and they gave rise to an environment of constant stress that rendered it hard to lead a regular life. The refusal of the king to die in a clean and speedy manner appeared to be one final act of selfishness that caused everyone around him to experience further inconvenience. The final days of the king's life were spent in a chair that was custom-made for him and allowed him to. In order to ensure that he slept in an upright position, he made sure that his head was supported by their hand. It was a pathetic image of a monarch who was unable to lie down in his own bed anymore. It became a symbol of how completely his physical state had undermined his dignity. He would be in this uncomfortable posture, and his servants would watch him struggle to breathe. His big body would shake as he attempted to draw air into his failing lungs. His situation took a sudden turn for the worse on the evening of June 25, 1830. George's condition was deteriorating. His complexion changed to an alarming shade of gray, which indicated that he was suffering from severe circulatory failure. His breathing became considerably more laborious than it normally would have been. The monarch appeared to be unconscious of how close death had come to him, despite the fact that his physicians were aware that the end was drawing near. Sir Henry Halford was dismissed for the evening, and he sat down in his chair to get ready for what would be his last night of sleep as a living man. During the penultimate night of George's life, Sir Wanwan Waller, who was George's ophthalmologist and one of the few devoted allies that remained, sat with the dying king. An extremely fat monarch who was nearing the end of his life was seen holding hands with one of the few persons who still cared enough to stay with him. This scene was both heartbreaking and beautiful. This basic human act of companionship showed the tragedy of a life that had been lived without genuine love or friendship. The juxtaposition between George's massive, failing physique and this simple human gesture of fellowship highlighted the tragedy. On June 26, 1830, as dawn came, George began to exhibit signs of the final suffering that he would experience. The irregularity of his breathing became more and more pronounced, and it appeared as though his gigantic body was being shut down system by system. It was around 3 o'clock in the morning when he finally came to from his restless sleep and suffered what would prove to be his last crisis, a bloody bowel movement that indicated that his digestive system had completely failed. The last coherent act that the monarch performed was to call for his physician, supposedly yelling out, "Sir Henry! Sir Henry! Fetch him! This is death!" and then calling for his physician. Everything that came before the final moments of George IV's life was just as devoid of dignity as the final moments themselves. According to a number of different reports, his dying words were either, "Surely this must be death," "Good God, what is this?" or simply nonsensical groaning as his big body finally succumbed to the accumulated harm that had been caused by decades of torture. It was 3:15 in the morning when he passed away. On the 26th of June, 1830, his head fell over the shoulder of his page, and his agonizing breathing finally came to an end. According to the findings of the autopsy that was performed after George's passing, the magnitude of the internal harm that his lifestyle had caused was disclosed. Massive fat deposits were discovered by his medical professionals all around his important organs, including his heart and kidneys to be more specific. It was hard for him to function normally because the amount of fat was so massive that it had physically crushed his internal organs. His liver revealed the typical damage that is associated with persistent alcoholism, while his stomach displayed indications of the broken blood artery that had triggered his ultimate crisis. It took a remarkable amount of time for the word of George IV passing to permeate around London. Yet the response from the general populace was unlike anything that previous monarchs had experienced. As an alternative to the customary expression of sorrow, there was a scarcely veiled sense of relief and, in many instances, open rejoicing during the period of grieving and loss that was experienced. The most prestigious newspaper of the time, The Times, published what is widely considered to be the most damning obituary ever written for a British king. The obituary asked pointedly, "What eye has wept for him? What heart has heaved one throb of unmercenary sorrow?" The paper continued its devastating assessment by stating that there was never an individual who was less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. If there was ever a buddy of his, a friend who was committed to him no matter what rank he held in life, We protest that the name of that friend never made it to us." The blunt honesty of this statement echoed a broader public feeling that George IV had been not only a poor monarch, but also a fundamentally repulsive human being, and that his death should be a cause for celebration rather than grief. The dead monarch was subjected to one last humiliation as a result of the difficulties that were encountered in the process of preparing his body for burial. The typical preparations for the funeral were rendered impossible due to his immense size, which necessitated the deployment of specially developed equipment and reinforcements to manage his weight. In order to hold his enormous body, the coffin had to be crafted out of Spanish mahogany and coated with lead. Additionally, the passageways of the palace were to be installed with protective wooden panels to prevent damage from the weight of the casket and the horrific contents it contained. Despite the fact that George had passed away, his body continued to give off the stink that had made his final years so uncomfortable for those who were in his immediate vicinity. While the undertakers who were working on the corpse complained about the smell, the embalming process proved to be more challenging than normal due to the stature of the king and the advanced condition of decay that had obviously begun even before he passed away. The man who had once been infatuated with perfumes and cosmetics had evolved into a source of aversion that could not be completely concealed by any amount of preparation. It was noticeable that the guests to Windsor Castle did not exhibit any true signs of sadness during the state funeral that was held there. Despite the fact that the protocol required everyone to wear black and maintain the right level of solemnity, observers remarked that the atmosphere was more curious than it was melancholy. Rather of paying their respects, several people came to marvel at the enormous casket, while others appeared to be confirming that George had in fact passed away rather than mourning his departure. However, rather than being treated with reverence, the funeral procession itself became a source of ridicule. There were contemporary records that depict courtiers telling jokes that were considered to be usual throughout the ritual. The prevailing tone suggested that the courtiers were relieved rather than grieving. There were reports that even George's brother William, who later became known as William IV, displayed an unseemly level of joy about his new role as king. He behaved in a manner that was so lacking in propriety that it surprised even those who were accustomed to royal dysfunction. A significant amount of noise and disruption occurred throughout the funeral ceremony that took place in St. George's Chapel, and these disturbances had nothing to do with genuine sadness. It was not the sobbing mourners who were the source of the sounds. Rather, it was the agitated guests who were ready for the procedures to come to a close so that they could go back to their usual lives. In the same manner as earlier royal funerals, George's was a solemn occasion that was discussed by almost everyone who was present. Within the context of the burial itself, specialized engineering was required to manage George's massive coffin. As a result of the weight, the floor of the royal vault needed to be reinforced in order to support it. Additionally, new pulleys and supports were constructed in order to safely lower the casket. Even this final mechanical process seemed to illustrate how George's physical excess had complicated every element of his existence, including death, which had become more difficult and expensive than it should have been. The immediate aftermath of George's passing displayed the extent to which he had alienated all of the people who had known him. There were no heartfelt recollections of private kindnesses or hidden virtues that emerged from friends or loved ones, nor were there any tributes that were truly affecting genuinely. Instead, the prevailing emotion was one of joy that a national embarrassment had finally come to an end, liberating Britain from the humiliation of being represented by a king who was so hideous and disordered. The Duke of Wellington, who was perhaps the most respected figure in Britain at the time, offered a typically forthright evaluation of the deceased king. He stated that the deceased king was the worst man he had ever fallen in love with in his entire life. He defined him as the most self-centered, the most dishonest, the most ill-natured, and the most completely devoid of any redeeming qualities. This verdict, which was delivered by a man who had known George personally for decades, had a great deal of weight and represented the opinions of a great number of those who had worked with the monarch in a professional capacity. The transfer from William III to William IV was accompanied by a sense of relief that was virtually palpable throughout the administration and the court establishment. William was a significant advance over his predecessor merely by virtue of the fact that he was a functional human being. This was despite the fact that William had his own peculiarities and limits. The contrast between the two brothers, one of whom was a hideous invalid and the other of whom was at least capable of performing fundamental royal duties, brought to light the fact that George had failed in every element of his duty. The historical evaluations of George IV's reign have been nearly unanimously negative, and historians have had a difficult time locating any beneficial legacy that could be attributed to his term as king. Despite the fact that his support of architecture and cultural achievements were important, they have been eclipsed by his personal shortcomings and the damage he caused to the institution of monarchy. The vast majority of academics have arrived at the conclusion that it would have been more beneficial for Britain if George had never been born, let alone become king. The lessons that may be learned from George's death in terms of medicine were generally disregarded by contemporary onlookers. These individuals were more concerned with the ethical and political repercussions of his failure than they were with comprehending the physiological processes that had led to his death. Not only was his death from issues connected to obesity unique for the historical period, but also had the potential to reveal vital insights into the health dangers associated with extreme overeating and drunkenness. However, these prospects for medical improvement were not taken advantage of. The satirical press had a field day with George's death and funeral, publishing cartoons and commentaries that mocked everything from his gigantic casket to the lack of true grieving following his passing. The creative tradition of royal satire reached new heights of viciousness in response to George's death. Artists felt free to express thoughts against a monarchy that had been accumulating for decades, but could not be uttered while the king was alive. This was a response to the fact that George had passed away. A reign that had been characterized by financial extravagance was finished off with a final insult when the cost of George's funeral and burial was incurred. The Treasury Department had to spend thousands of pounds in order to handle his large body, which required elaborate ceremonies, specialized equipment, and reinforcements. This was carried out during a time when the nation was dealing with debt. Even after he passed away, George continued to be more expensive and bothersome than any other typical person would have been expected to be.